Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to meet new friends, and I want to thank Lee for the invitation to come. It's always a privilege and an honor for me to be able to share my great-grandpa's story. It's been an ongoing project for me and a labor of love, I might add, for more years than I care to remember. It actually began when I was about 8 years old, when my mom and dad and I would go to Manchester, Tennessee, to visit my grandmother Ferris and my Aunt Ruth, and while Mama and my grandmother and aunt were fixing dinner, Daddy and I would go play in the storage room upstairs. There was this old trunk that I was just fascinated with, and my daddy was really intrigued with. And this wasn't just an ordinary trunk, I might add. It was very old, it was beaten up, the top was lined with some wallpaper looking stuff, and it had belonged to my dad's own grandfather, my great-grandfather, Dr. John Kennerly Ferris, and it was filled with his belongings. His small black medical bag containing a few of his instruments and some brown pill bottles, stuff like that, was on one side. His spectacles, his watch, a small Bible, along with a china shaving cup and a straight razor, a crooked walking cane, a few items of clothing, all of the things that had belonged to him, some of which I have in my possession now, were on the other side. And beneath these items was a bundle wrapped in an old kerchief-like cloth, mostly white, kind of yellow by then, with with pale flowers that had been embroidered on it, and the initial F. And inside this trunk were letters that he had written to his wife Mary. Lee, if you would. Thank you. That's my great-grandfather. Some people say they see a resemblance. And the next one, that's my great-grandmother, Mary Elizabeth Austell. But this bundle contained the letters that he had written to his wife Mary while he was off serving the Confederacy. And it also included with this bundle was a .53 caliber unspent bullet. I've often wondered what the significance of that bullet might have been. I must admit that in my young life I was more intrigued with the stuff that was in that trunk than I was the letters, which my dad seemed to prefer. He would read some of the individual letters each time we were there and try to explain to me the significance of my great-grandfather's words. Over the years, Daddy and I spent a lot of time playing in that trunk with all that good stuff in the closet. And by the early 1980s, my dad had retired and his health was in decline. And I had matured enough to be able to appreciate the legacy of my great-grandpa. We revisited those letters, and transcribing them began in earnest. I Xeroxed the letters, and both for a better working copy and to protect the originals, of course, and so the project began. I would transcribe a few at a time, and Daddy would read up on the history of the 41st, and we would follow the regiment and understand why they went from here to there and sometimes back again. We had a lot of fun with it, and I learned a great deal, I must say, and that was how things continued until my dad passed away in 1989. At that point, I just kind of put it away and just couldn't deal with it anymore. But in 1991, I did a program in Franklin County, and the Franklin County Historical Society wanted to publish it. And I knew it needed to be finished, and I knew I had to do it, so I got it out and decided that I would get it done. I was wanting to preserve this legacy that was left to me by my great-grandfather, and I knew that I had to do it. But I must say that reading the letters written by my great-grandfather to my great-grandmother, it almost seemed like an invasion of their privacy. But then I began to realize how very fortunate I was to be able to share his joys, to share his sorrows, his loneliness and despair, and to really get to know this man, and to appreciate, above all else, the honor and respect his commitment to a cause that he knew was lost. Lee?
Sorry.
Thank you. To a commitment that he knew was lost, to a cause that he knew was lost. So Letters to Mary was finished and came off the press for the first time, published by the Franklin County Historical Society in 1994. It was out of print for several years, and I kept thinking I was going to do a revision, and then in 2014, the Coffee County Historical Society contacted me, and we decided to do a revision. And I was really pleased with the revision when that was done. It had been in the making for several years, and by this time, is it numbered? Thank you. It had been in revision, and I mean the idea had been going on for quite some time, but by this time I had a lot of things that I didn't have with the first printing. I was thrilled when the revision came out. And I felt that with the additional information, the pictures, etc., which the second edition included, the story was much more complete. And I was very pleased with what we'd done with it. The program tonight is an excerpt from Letters to Mary, as he recalls his experiences at Fort Donelson and of his fate thereafterward. But first, let's take a brief look at what was happening this early on in the war and just how and why John Kennerly Ferris happened to be there in the first place. February 1862 was not a good month for the Confederacy. A little more than 163 years ago, on February the 16th, 1862, Fort Donelson was surrendered, and the gateway to the Confederacy was literally opened. The fall of Fort Donelson set the stage for the Battle of Shiloh, which would occur less than 2 months later. 3 long years and many battles later, on April the 9th, 1865, General Lee would surrender his army, and it would all be history. Why and how could the implications from the Battle of Fort Donelson be so far-reaching and have such devastating consequences for the men of the South? When Fort Donelson fell, bells rang jubilantly throughout the North, since it was their first major victory of the war. But things were still pretty quiet in Dixieland. Just a month before, the Confederates had seemed invincible. With the fall of Fort Henry, just days before, the necessity of maintaining control of the Cumberland River at Fort Donelson became an even greater risk. The Confederates' position here was much stronger than it had been at Fort Henry, and Union ironclad forces would have to face 2 river batteries with 12 heavy guns. Grant's troops coming overland from Fort Henry arrived on February the 13th, and Fort Donelson found itself literally encircled with some 15,000 Union troops. The weather the day before had been unseasonably warm, and many Union men mistakenly believed that this was the way it was and was typical of the South, and threw away their heavy winter gear, an act they would soon regret, kind of like yesterday and today. There were sporadic clashes on that day, and neither side gained ground. Nightfall brought bitter cold, sleet and snow that caused much suffering. The morning of February the 14th dawned cold and quiet. Early in the afternoon, the stillness was broken by a furious roar, and the earth began to shake. The Union gunboats were exchanging iron valentines, with the 11 big guns in the southern batteries. During this 1.5-hour duel, the Confederate guns inflicted such extensive damage that the gunboats were forced to retreat. The hills and hollows echoed with cheers from the Southern soldiers. The Confederate generals, John Floyd, Gideon Pillow, Simon Buckner, and Bushrod Johnson, also rejoiced. But at the same time, they recognized the reality of the situation, with Grant receiving reinforcements daily. They were almost entirely encircled by Union troops, and the danger of being starved into submission was not a pleasant thought. Accordingly, they massed their troops against the Union right, hoping to clear a route to Nashville and safety. The battle on February the 15th raged all morning, the Union Army grudgingly retreating step by step. Just as it seemed that the way was clear, the Southern troops were ordered to return to their entrenchments, a result of confusion and indecision among the Confederate commanders. Grant immediately launched a vigorous counterattack, retaking most of the lost ground and getting new positions as well. The way of escape was closed once more. With this development, Floyd and Pillow turned over command of Fort Donelson to Buckner and slipped away to Nashville with about 2,000 men. The next morning, Buckner surrendered. Within a week of Fort Donelson's takeover, Nashville, the first Confederate capital and industrial center to fall, would be surrendered. And within a month, the Union line would extend all the way from Bowling Green, Kentucky to Huntsville, Alabama. Mm-hmm. Federal forces first made their way into Murfreesboro, my hometown, on March the 10th, 1862. This was a very demoralizing time indeed for Southerners. Albert Sidney Johnston, the highest ranking field officer in the Confederacy, had a major problem with his forces being split 200 miles apart and a victorious enemy in control of the rivers and railroads in between. He withdrew further south and reestablished his line of command at Corinth, Mississippi, with about 44,000 men, who would soon see action on April the 6th at Shiloh. Two names would emerge from the fight at Fort Donelson, one being a cavalryman by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who defied the philosophy of surrender dictated by Generals Floyd, Buckner, and Pillow, when he stated that he had not brought these men just to be prisoners of war. So he led the way and 700 followed, never once encountering the enemy. Forrest's own words were, "Boys, these people are talking about surrender, and I am not going to do that. I am going out of this place before they do, or bust hell wide open." The other name belonged to a more or less unknown Union general by the name of Ulysses S. Grant, and a new term was born with his reply to General Buckner's request for terms of capitulation, when Grant responded that no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender will be accepted. Among those affected by this unconditional and immediate surrender was Dr. John Kennerly Ferris, Company I, 41st Tennessee, my great-grandfather. Here is his story, his version of what happened and his fate thereafter, as he saw it, as he wrote it, as he lived it. So please join me as we accompany great-grandpa on his journey to Fort Donelson. Well, let me tell you just a little bit about him first. John Kennerly Ferris served the Confederacy as a doctor, Company I, of the 41st Tennessee Infantry from the beginning of the war until almost the end. He was born on April 18, 1836 in Franklin County, Tennessee, and as a young man of about 20, began the study of medicine under Dr. J.E. Howe of Pleasant Hill. He married Mary Elizabeth Austell, of neighboring Coffee County on August the 27th, 1857, and furthered his studies of medicine in Arkansas the following year. He practiced medicine in Montgomery County, Arkansas for a couple of years, returning to Prairie Plains.
Nope. I'm distracted, sorry.
Returning to Prairie Plains area of Coffee County in 1859. He was 25 years old when, on November 26, 1861, he, along with his two brothers, Bud and Sam, enlisted for a period of 12 months in the Confederate Army. He was a private in Company I of the 41st Tennessee at the time of his enlistment at Winchester, and was promoted to hospital steward on January the 4th of 1862. Dr. Ferris was an avid record keeper and begun an accounting of his daily experiences on the day of his enlistment. After leaving Winchester, his company arrived in Nashville, then on to Camp Trousdale for training, then a brief stay at Bowling Green in Russellville, and back to Nashville, where he would remain until early 1862. Then on Thursday, February the 13th of 1862, he notes that most of his regiment had already gone on to Fort Donelson, where it was rumored that a big fight was about to begin. He was quite anxious to take part in it, because this was the first battle, but was denied permission to join his regiment by Lieutenant Wilhoit, as he was the only physician in his command. However, there were no sick or wounded in Nashville, so he pulled rank and got an order from the commander of the post, allowing him to go immediately to Fort Donelson. He arrived finally after a very cold and uncomfortable riverboat journey on Friday, February the 14th, 1862. He did indeed participate in the battle and was nearly killed while en route to the hospital to help the wounded. He recalls all of these events in a letter he wrote to Mary almost 8 months later. Camp Coldwater, Friday, October the 31st, 1862. Well, Mary, I have several times thought that I would give a brief account of my time at Fort Donelson and how I happened to be there. Thursday, February the 13th, 1862, I was in the city of Nashville with some 16 or 20 of our regiment when I heard the fight had begun at Fort Donelson. And knowing our regiment was there, I was very anxious to be with them. So I went to Lieutenant Wilhoit, who was in command of the detachment of our regiment, and I believe the detachment of all the regiments which belonged to General Buckner's command, and asked him for an order for me to rejoin the regiment. He told me that he could not do this and give me a leave without laying himself liable, as I was the only physician with him or under his command. This troubled me a good deal, and I became anxious to be with him and studied about an hour as to how I could manage to get to the regiment and the propriety of leaving without an order. Suddenly an idea struck me that I might get an order from the commander of the post in Nashville, who I allowed would outrank Lieutenant Wilhoit and make me safe in leaving. By inquiring for his quarters, I found him without any difficulty and told him how I was situated there, and further that I had sent all the sick under my charge to the hospital. He spells hospital, H-O-S-P-I-T-T-L-E, and was there idle and thought my services might be demanded at Fort Donelson, and I desired to go there. Without returning a word, he wrote me a pass down there and told me to take the first boat. I immediately returned to my quarters, took my knapsack from my trunk with a suit of clothes, went down to the river and got aboard a little job boat, preparing to leave for Fort Donelson. This was 8:00 a.m. The boat was soon ready to start, but was found to be fast upon a pile of iron, which the water had covered. They worked to get it off until 2:00, apparently to no avail. I grew tired, got off the boat, and gave out going, and strolled over town until nearly sunset. So I went down to the river again and found the boat off the iron and about ready to start. But there we remained until 8 o'clock p.m. The little thing was so crowded with passengers that her cabin would not hold over 1/4 of us. So the remainder had to take passage on her decks, where we liked to have frozen during the night. Could get neither supper nor breakfast Friday morning. Friday, about 1 o'clock p.m., we got down to Clarksville. There, I got off the uncomfortable little job boat and got on the Runyon, a nice and comfortable boat. We there learned that they were still fighting at Dover. This made all apparently anxious to get on down there. We did not stay there long, but went on down the river. When we got in about 10 or 12 miles of Dover, we stopped and took on wood, enough to pile all around on lower deck to protect the hands from the balls of the enemy. So we did not know but what the boat would be shot into. About dark, we landed at Dover. Everything was quiet. The two contending forces were as still as though they had been friends almost. About 10 o'clock in the night, I found our regiment and found the boys nearly worn out with fatigue, fasting and cold. They had not a tent and scarcely a fire. Some were lying in the snow wrapped in their blankets asleep. Some were sitting around a few coals of fire, and some at one thing and some at another. I was very hungry and asked them for something to eat, as I had eaten but a snack since Thursday morning. They told me they had nothing, nor had had in some time. But one of the boys had a little parched coffee in his pocket, which he gave to me, and which I pounded in a tin cup, the best I could with an old chunk, and borrowed a coffee pot and made it full of coffee for 5 of us, who had constructed a little fire, barely sufficient to boil a coffee pot of water. We drank the coffee, which seemed to do us a good deal of good, although it was barely fit to drink, and would not at all have been used under ordinary circumstances. We 5 sit around the same little fire until 3 o'clock a.m. of Saturday morning, talking of the previous and expected fight. All through the night, we could once in a while hear the pickets shooting at each other, and some very close to us. At 3 o'clock, the officers came round and gave orders for the men to get in line, for it was thought we might be attacked in a short time. Notwithstanding, the ground was covered with snow and the weather very cold. I felt pretty lively, though, and was anxious for the coming conflict, though I knew and told the boys that the day would not close without some as hard a fighting as had been done during the war. Just at daybreak, the regiment was ordered forward. It was generally known that we were going round on our left wing and engage the enemy, but I never felt more contented in my life. During the night, everything had been quite still, with the exception of an occasional fire by the pickets, and we remained until we had gone near a half a mile, by which time the sun had just begun to show itself, peeping, as it were, over the hills and mountains of the east. At that time, we were moving on in line, I keeping with the file closers and watching the appearance of the boys particularly, which I was unable to do as I had my gun to carry. We struck the foot of a large hill, excuse me, marched rather across the point, but to my great surprise, just as we got barely on top of the hill, the enemy discovered us and turned loose at us with a cannon, the first that I had ever heard fire in battle. The boys all dropped to the ground and I followed suit, but we rose in an instant and were ordered to double quick. The ball passed immediately over me. When I got up, I felt considerably confused and must acknowledge a little fear. The first thing in my mind was that I had gotten myself voluntarily into a devil of a snap. But at the same time, I thought of you and little Sammy, that was his 1-year-old son at the time, and I determined not to disgrace me and him if my head was shot off. So I braced myself up and marched straight forward, as resolute as death itself, but not without feeling somewhat uncomfortable. I looked at every man in the regiment to see how they looked. None looked like they were scared, and I argued to myself that it did not seem reasonable that God Almighty had so constituted me as to make me more of a coward than any of the regiment. We had not double-quicked over 50 yards until they cut loose again with a shell. The boys, being used to them, dropped to the ground again, and at the same moment I accidentally slipped down, hurting my knee on the frozen ground slightly. The shell passed immediately over me, and I think would have cut me in half had I not been on the ground. It burst in almost 20 yards of us, but done us no harm. I rose instantly, and the first thing said to myself, well, I will not get hurt today, for Providence has saved my life, and God is on my side. We went down the hill at a double quick, then followed the hollow something like a quarter or half a mile, the enemy not molesting us. At length we struck the foot of another high hill, at which time a good many of us dropped our knapsacks and left them on account of fatigue. It was a good piece to the top of the hill, and almost halfway up the battery had stalled, and the enemy was pouring it to them with ball and shell rapidly. We marched up to it and stopped for it to get it out of the way, some of our men assisting in pushing it. At this moment, General Floyd rode up and ordered us onward. Our colonel told him we were waiting for the artillery to get out of the way. He said, wait for nothing, but go ahead. We started, the enemy giving us grape, canister, and shell heavily. At that point, I got used to the things and feared them no more. We moved on to the top of the hill, or almost, and was ordered to lie down in a little hollow to the right of the road, just behind one of our batteries, which was playing upon the enemy, but was soon ordered to recross the road and lie on the breast of the hill at the termination of a large hollow in the rear of the battery and to the right, also in the rear of the 14th Mississippi Regiment, and a short distance behind them, who were, and had been for some time, fighting like fury. The enemy endeavored to shell us out of the hollow, but failed in doing so, as their shells passed generally over us. They tried us with grape and canister, but no effect. We lay there until 11 o'clock, with the exception of 3 companies, which had been ordered off to drive the sharpshooters from their batteries and defend them. General Floyd and our brigade surgeon took their position just behind us. About 11 o'clock, there came a man running down to us and asked for a physician to go to the 14th Mississippi Regiment. The cries of the wounded at this time was horrible. The roar of the cannon and the noise of the musketry was deafening. The brigade surgeon ordered me to go to them. I rose and started as fast as I could to get to them, having to cross a heavy cannon fire before I reached them, and immediately after crossing that, I was in range of the musket balls, which fell all around me and passed over my head so thick that it looked like I could have held up my hat and caught it full. The Mississippi boys fell fast, but fought like men. I went to work on them as best I could and had at length to tear up my haversack for bandages. I found a fellow with 2 wounds in the breast and saw he was bleeding from an artery. I carried him down to the hollow to get assistance in dressing his wounds. The brigade surgeon assisted me and ordered me to accompany him to a hospital. Yoo-hoo. And told me to report myself to the medical director, which I did. The boats by this time had arrived. I suppose it was 11:30 o'clock to take off the wounded. I was ordered to service in a hospital, which was a vacated hotel. But about the time I got warm, Dr. Clopton came for me to assist him in the hospital he had charge of, which was just across the road. I went over and went to work, but did not work long until the Yankees turned loose at the hospitals and struck ours with several grape loads and passed 2 cannonballs through. We went to work to raise the flags higher, and I suppose brought them into notice in about an hour and a half. At about 1:30, J.K. Buckner was brought in. Poor fella, I felt so sorry for him. J.K. Buckner was from Winchester and would later marry Dr. Ferris's sister. So that would be his future brother-in-law. I got Dr. Clopton to dress his wound immediately and started him to the boat, telling him never to stop until he got home. Clopton, myself, and another physician, with occasional help from others, worked on until 8 o'clock in the night, at which time we got through with all that were sent to our hospital and got most of them on the boats. But fighting stopped when darkness forbid further action. We got our instruments clean and sat down to rest at 9 o'clock, and I do not think I was ever tireder in my entire life. Several physicians and officers came in, and we talked somewhat about what we had seen. I told them that we who lived would all be prisoners of war by 3 hours by Sunday morning. I felt very much like it. I had seen all day that the enemy had 4 to 5 to 1 and had us surrounded. I thought we would fight next morning, but knew we would be overpowered. At 10 o'clock p.m., we lay down on the floor to take a nap for the first in a long time. At 3 o'clock, some fella came and told us that our forces were going to retreat. Excuse me. Excuse me. And ordered us to have the remainder of our wounded put on the boat, and then to make our escape if we could, and if not, to surrender as prisoners of war, as we would soon be released. As the order came from the Surgeon General, we went to work, and after a while we got most of them off. I kept asking everyone that I could see coming from the regiment what had gone with it. At length the gentleman told me that it had cut its way through and was retreating. I ran in and told Dr. Clopton the same, and told him I thought we had better go also. So we bundled up and started down to the boats to try to get aboard, but could not get nigh them because of the guards. Dr. Clopton asked me what we should do. It was near daylight. I told him we must foot it up the riverbank. He did not believe this practical. I insisted in trying, so we put out, only taking 1 blanket. I suppose we went a half mile or so when we saw, as it was getting a little light, 5 men coming toward us, and who we took to be the enemy. There, said he, look yonder. What shall we do? Says I, we shall march straight forward, for if we run, they will shoot us. We met them. They asked where we were going. We told them we were going into the country a little piece. Said they, the enemy is just before us out here, and you cannot get out. We found that they were our men trying just what we were going to try. It was then proposed that we cross the river on some logs, and agreed to, but before we could find any, daylight came upon us, and to our surprise, the regiment and Forest Cavalry had gone. The white flags were visible in our works. Now we were all prisoners. John Ferris spent the next 7 months as a prisoner of war at Camp Morton, Indiana, and it was during this time, partly to relieve the boredom of prison life, that he began keeping an account of daily life in prison. What they had to eat, who died, who took the oath, recipes for diseases, even writing poetry. He kept a detailed list of the men of the 41st Tennessee and their fate. The earliest entry seems to have been a poem entitled Thoughts of Home, dated February 1862, doubtless written soon after Ferris arrived at Camp Morton. He expresses his love for his family, for his mother and father and sisters, and he seems early on to have contemplated keeping a diary, at least when motivated by an unusual triple murder and equally unusual late spring weather. Here are just a couple of sporadic entries. Camp Morton near Indianapolis, Indiana, Tuesday, April the 15th, 1862. 3 men were shot lying in their bunk, 2 Kentuckians and 1 Mississippi. Thursday, April the 24th, 1862, snow and sleet. While a prisoner, Ferris continued to exercise many of his duties as hospital steward. He may even have taken his responsibility with greater seriousness, and certainly saw new diseases, keeping notes on standard practices and unusual occurrences. Some of the diseases that he listed were diarrhea, camp cough, sore throat, itch, jaundice, mumps, gunshot wounds, gonorrhea. And he's got a pretty good cure for them, so if anybody's having any problems, you might want to take a look at that. Between February the 23rd and August the 28th, he whiled away his hours of confinement and boredom at Camp Morton by compiling a list of the Confederate forces and losses at Fort Donelson, and then he summarized all the numbers. And he included the menu for what they had to eat for the week of May the 11th to the 17th, 1862, even including some recipes for bread pudding that he and his brothers had concocted. And he listed all of the battles for the year to date as he knew them. Prison life must have been pretty boring. Let's see here. Okay, Camp Morton, Indianapolis, Indiana, May 1862. The foregoing is the fare for our meal. J.K. Ferris, George Bud Ferris, and Samuel Jackson Ferris, and other members. On Sunday, they had a breakfast of shortened bread, coffee, and fried bacon, eggs, and for dinner they had baked beef, Irish potatoes, and cornbread. Supper, fried beef, biscuits, coffee, butter, and molasses. And more or less for the rest of the week, they had the very same thing. It just varied whether they had it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. But at least they had food, so that was good. At the beginning midsummer, rumors of an exchange produced a federal campaign to get prisoners to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. But great-grandpa and his brothers chose not to do this, not to take this oath, although there were several opportunities to do so. But he carefully preserved the text and kept a detailed listing of the members of the regiments who did. And then in August, the men finally began to look forward to being exchanged. On Wednesday, August the 8th of 1862, he wrote, "We and about 4,000 prisoners are looking for an order to start south in a few days to be exchanged. There are about 4,000 of us put in here in February last, taken at Fort Donelson. I suppose 300 or more have died." As the negotiations for the exchange moved toward completion, prisoners were loaded on boats for the trip downriver. Ferris traveled from boat to boat to attend to the medical needs, and freely went ashore to obtain supplies and sometimes to bury a prisoner who had expired. When the boats anchored above Vicksburg and he visited Confederate territory in Louisiana, he rejected a planter's suggestion that he escape. On Saturday, the September 6th, he was aboard the Fanny Bullet near Cairo, Illinois, and he said, "We are still aboard and have been for 8 days of the steamer Fanny Bullet, anchored in the middle of the Ohio River opposite Cairo. We're all very anxious to leave here for Vicksburg, where we hope to live better, as it is hard living here. Bacon, hard crackers, and coffee is our diet, and all have to cook on one stove. Consequently, we eat most of our meal raw. and make coffee as often as we can, sometimes once, sometimes twice per day. We drink river water, which is very warm. And then in September 6th and 7th, he says, I was ordered from the Fanny Bullock to the J.H. Dove to take charge of the sick, about 130 in number. The Dove is a nice boat and of moderate size, and is the boat chartered for a hospital boat for the fleet of prisoners. And then September the 8th, he said, I have routine charge of everything and responsible for the treatment of the sick and their general welfare, but have one assistant and an excellent steward, which with 18 nurses to assist me, I fare very well, am allowed to visit the shore when I want to see other boats. And then things are really looking up. It said Wednesday, September the 10th of 1862 at 8 o'clock, we arrived in Memphis. We were first anchored in the river, but after an hour or so, the boats all went to the shore for coal, where we were met by hundreds of enthusiastic people, mostly ladies, who continually waved their handkerchiefs in token of their feelings of respect for us. After dinner, I went over in town to procure some stimulants for the sick, as we were running very short. The ladies everywhere met me with smiling faces and all anxious to shake me by the hand and say to me, God bless you. The ladies went to work and soon got what whiskey, brandy, and wine I wanted, besides pickles and preserves, with money to purchase tobacco and other such small articles as the sick needed. By Thursday, September the 11th, still on the boat, I arrived 10 miles below Memphis on board the Dove with near 160 on her. We left the fleet at Memphis, putting on coal, and came ahead to get on some wood and bury a man who died last night. We buried him on the Tennessee shore in a square box, but another the same way yesterday morning before day. And then he got sick from drinking river water. He said, I have been sick 2 or 3 days and not able to do anything for the sick. Dr. Moorhead of Louisiana, my assistant and companion, has done all in his power, but with scant supply of medicine, inefficient nurses, and the great amount of labor, he has not been able to do what he might have done under favorable circumstances. Consequently, several have died. The ladies were especially enthusiastic in holding their expression of the great reward they have for Southern soldiers. The bank of the Mississippi is pretty well crowded with women and children and some men to see us pass, who salute and hurrah Jeff Davis. We went ashore this evening to bury a man, and while the boys were burying him, I went to the house of a rich planter, and the lady gave me some sweet milk and cornbread and seemed very kind to me. Said if I would stay and not go back to the boat, I would be sent home. I was now in the state of Louisiana. How she meant I would be sent, I do not know, but she stated that I would not be allowed to walk. The temptation was great and almost resistless, but my honor forced me to go back to the boat, which I did. He was finally exchanged a couple of days later, along with several thousand other Confederates near Vicksburg, Mississippi, on September the 17th of 1862. The sick, nurses, and I have just got aboard this boat, and now I suppose that we are exchanged. We landed at Vicksburg about 12 o'clock, and to our great satisfaction, were one time more from under the bayonet. Reorganization of the 41st began almost immediately. And he actually began keeping the diary in the form of letters to his wife, Mary. At that time, he kept them in a journal. It was like a 3-column journal, and he would write the letters, and when he got a journal full, he would send it home by whoever was going or any way he could. He sent at least 3 journals home, which survived, recounting his experiences from the time of his enlistment then more or less on a daily or weekly basis throughout the remainder of 1862 and 1863. He participated in the major battles of Vicksburg, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Atlanta, Franklin, and finally Nashville. En route to Chickamauga, he was injured in a train wreck at Allatoona, near Atlanta. And when he rejoined his regiment at Chattanooga, he could not get a furlough home, despite being so near to his home in Winchester. And by that time, he had not seen his wife and little boy since the time of his enlistment, November 21st of 1861. Even after getting letters to Mary, getting letters from Mary and to Mary ceased. When old man Higginbotham's son deserted and old man Higginbotham stopped carrying the mail. I had an interesting, anybody here by the name of Higginbotham before I tell this story? I was doing this program and I mentioned that. And there was a gentleman there, small world, who let me know real fast that he was a descendant of the Higginbotham family and that he did not desert. He had to go, he just had to leave for a little while and kill one of them damn Van Zants because everybody knew they weren't no good. So I stand corrected, but it was just a misunderstanding. By late 1863, he, along with many others, were very disillusioned. And quite frankly, he no longer believed in the cause for which he was fighting. He had not seen Mary and his little boy, who was now 3 years old. That was at the time of his enlistment, of course. But he would not desert because of his honor. In the very last surviving letter that he wrote to Mary, he was a very disheartened and disillusioned man. This was camp near Dalton, Georgia, Saturday, December the 26th, 9 o'clock a.m. Dear Mary, Christmas is past, and I am truly glad it is so. For such a day as we had yesterday is by no means agreeable. The drunk men in our regiment and brigade could not be numbered. I had thought that the Army had to some extent got over its demoralization, witnessed in the retreat from Missionary Ridge and immediately after. But I was badly mistaken. The Army is yet disgracefully demoralized. Nothing could have afforded more evidence of this fact than yesterday's events. The colonel commanding the brigade was beastly drunk, and so was the colonel commanding the regiment and the officer of the day. Some of the guards were drunk, and many men and officers throughout the brigade were the same. Oh, the scenes of yesterday were too awful to contemplate. Guards and officers were cursed and abused by drunken officers. Our cause is lost, certain. And I would just say now that I not know, but it will be as well otherwise. I am of the opinion that, should we gain our independence, that we would have nothing more than a tottering of aristocrat government, and many are of this opinion. I also understand that one major and 4 privates were killed dead by shots of drunken rowdies. God knows you can have no idea what took place yesterday, last night and night before. I am troubled at the way everything is going. If I had known at the beginning of the war what I know now, I today would have been in Canada making an honest living. God knows I wish I was there now. Everything in this army is disheartening and disorderly. Yes, Father, I would say disgraceful, everlasting disgraceful. Everything is very high, and soldiers have lost all confidence in Confederate money. There are no more letters, none for 1864, either because of conditions, and he was unable to write or had no way or opportunity to get them home to Mary, or perhaps they were lost. The spring and summer of 1864 was spent with intense fighting in Georgia before Atlanta fell on September 4th. Then back to Tennessee and Franklin, where he witnessed the annihilation of the Army of Tennessee. Following the Battle of Franklin, he was placed in charge of one of the hospitals there, where he remained with the wounded. After the Battle of Nashville, as Confederates retreated back through Franklin, heading toward Alabama, presumably on December the 17th of 1864, he was once again captured in order to retreat, along with his sick and wounded, to General Thomas in Nashville. He decided he didn't want to do this, and along with 2 other men, left Franklin under cover of darkness without so much as a blanket. His clothes were threadbare, his shoes were worn out. He had not seen his wife and little boy since November of 1861, 3 years prior. He planned to escape the Federals in Franklin and then rejoin his unit after a trip home to Coffee County to see his family, get more clothing, and rest up a bit. It took him 8 days traveling under cover of darkness in the dead of winter to travel the approximately 65 miles to his father-in-law's home in Coffee County near Hillsborough, where his wife and son were living. And when he finally got there, he was sick, worn out, and very war-weary. Nonetheless, he made every attempt to find out what had happened to the remnants of the Army of Tennessee and how he could cross the Tennessee River to rejoin his command. But we know what he was doing based upon his statements from his application for pension, for Civil War pension. As he recounted those events in 1906, he stated, "I was, as a matter of fact, a prisoner, surrounded by heavy guard lines when I escaped and left Franklin. I was 8 days and nights reaching Hillsborough, Coffee County, traveling at night and through snow, sleet, and in freezing weather, passing guard lines, pickets, Federal troops in close proximity, oftentimes in the travel from Franklin to Hillsborough. I had no idea where the Confederate Army would cross the Tennessee River, and no means of knowing, except that it had gone south. The route I pursued was a direct route to the Tennessee River and to Chattanooga. My home was in the neighborhood of Hillsborough. I was bare of clothing. I purposed to stop at my home and ascertain the location and travel of the Army, and if possible, obtain assistance and rejoin the Army. Having evaded the Federals with great difficulty, as before stated, I reached Hillsborough and ascertained that the remnant army had crossed the river somewhere, but could not find out at what point. I reached Hillsborough, Coffee County, on the 27th day of December, and in short time thereafter, I made my start to rejoin the Army. I went out of Coffee County, over near the borderline of Alabama, in the mountains near Tennessee River, and found every avenue of opportunity to cross the river closed. Being thus situated, and conceiving no way to reach the Army, I was driven to the alternative of returning to my home near Hillsborough. My community was infested by the murderous gang of Briggses, who were killing and burning in the neighborhood. I was a practicing physician, and my neighborhood wanted and very much needed my services. I was as an army surrounded. I could not stay with friends nor at home. I had no means of escape. There was so much bitterness on the part of the Briggsy gang. In effect, I thought the war was over. With the surroundings in which I was placed, the cause did seem to be lost, but I stood ready and purposed and intended to fight them on if opportunity afforded me. I saw no other way for the time being but to seek protection from the Provost Marshal at Deckard, about 14 miles from the neighborhood. Under his promised protection, I entered into practice of medicine in the community. I borrowed a horse to ride and began with my services as a physician to the widows, orphans, and the community. I was forced to report once a week to the said Provost Marshal at his headquarters. In my practice at the close of the war, I faced the danger of the Briggsy gang and underwent the dangers and exposures in the service of the widows and orphans and community at large. But I did all that I could from the beginning to the close of our great struggle with faithfulness and devotion to our cause. When John Tennerly Ferris finally took the oath of allegiance, it was early March of 1865. The war would end in less than a month. His wife was pregnant with their third child, a second son, who would be my grandfather, whom I never knew, who would be born at the end of the year. John was needed at home. As promised by the Provost Marshal, John Ferris did receive protection from those in his community who would do him harm. A Pennsylvania cavalryman by the name of John Neese, on duty protecting Morris Ferry on the Elk River during 1864 and 65, was assigned to accompany Ferris on his travels as he ministered to the sick and those needing medical care. An odd friendship developed between these two men of opposing armies, and Neese was himself wounded, saving Ferris's life on one occasion. After the war ended, and Neese returned to his home in Pennsylvania, the two men kept in touch. Then Neese returned to Coffee County in the summer of 1867, and along with his father-in-law, George Emery, purchased land adjoining the Ferris Austell farm. They returned the following year and would live the remainder of their lives in their adopted state. 1 decade later, a daughter, Mary, would be born to John Neese and his wife. She would grow up to marry the second son of John Ferris, John Tennerly Ferris Jr., when he completed medical school in 1899. This man and this woman were my grandparents. My dad was the youngest of 4 children. Dr. Ferris continued his medical practice in Coffee County until a stroke forced his retirement in 1901. He had served his community for more than 42 years. He died on August the 7th of 1910. His beloved wife, Mary, had preceded him in death on March the 21st of 1885. Of their 8 children, only one would live to the ripe old age of 72, my grandfather, whom I never knew. But his letters to Mary did survive, and through those letters, his legacy lives, not only through his family, but for all who have an interest in Civil War history, and also for those who simply like to read other people's mail. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope you've enjoyed meeting my grandfather. I have enjoyed sharing his story with you. Any questions? Well, thank you again. It's been my pleasure.
You got one here, man.
Yes, sir.
Right here.
Oh, yeah, oh, good.
So was your grandfather, so as you mentioned, your grandfather was a doctor for the Confederacy. Did he volunteer or was he drafted into
He and his 3 brothers volunteered. They thought it would be a service of less than a year. Oh, it was going to be a grand adventure.
Thank you.
Next question.
Anybody else? All right.